So I'm very pleased to introduce DeRose today. So Joe, he was just explaining to us before we started, has spent his whole life in the Bay Area, where he was an undergrad and a grad student. And then he was a postdoc shared between Berkeley and Santa Cruz, but now he's at Berkeley, based at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. He works on a range of topics in cosmology. It's sort of the interface between simulations and data analysis. And that's essentially what he's going to talk to us about today. So weak lensing and galaxy clustering science using cosmological simulations. So it's all yours, Joe.
Great, thanks, Douglas. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, virtually, but I'm excited to tell you about the science I've been working on. So quick outline of the talk. So I'm going to provide a roadmap to accurate and precise constraints on cosmological physics from cross correlations between galaxy clustering and weak lensing. So I'll motivate a little bit at the beginning why you might want to care about galaxy clustering and weak lensing. And then I'll break down the rest of the talk into two parts. The first will be about getting accurate and precise models for lensing and clustering cross correlations through a combination of perturbation theory and simulation. And in the second part, I'll tell you about how we can perform robustness tests of these very complex analyses using simulations so that we can ensure that if we think we've detected new physics, that we have indeed detected new physics and not systematics. So for that, I'll give a case study of the Dark Energy survey. And then at the very end, I'll just mention the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument. Okay, so let's get started. So over the last 30 plus years, we've begun to converge on something called the standard model of cosmology. And this standard model is a picture of how the universe has evolved over the last approximately 13 billion years. And this picture starts with quantum fluctuations in the very early universe that are made macroscopic by inflation. And those quantum fluctuations then seed the large scale structure that's imprinted on the cosmic microwave background. That large scale structure then collapses and grows and forms the late time structure that we observe in galaxy surveys today. So that's this clumpy stuff down here. And that growth of structure is driven by the presence of dark matter. And then at very late times in a cosmic sense, a period of accelerated expansion is driven by something called dark energy. And so on this slide alone, I've mentioned three things that inflation, dark matter, and dark energy that aren't described by the standard model of particle physics. All three of these things were first posited to explain cosmological observations. And I don't think it's controversial to say that the resolution and continued study of them will be led by cosmological observations still. Oops. And so I think this provides a really good motivation to kind of stare very deeply into the data that we have gathered and will gather over the next 10 years to try to understand the fundamental physics that's driving these three things. So because we think that large scale structure is sourced by these stochastic quantum mechanical fluctuations in the early universe, that means that all of the inference that we do in large scale structure cosmology has to be statistical. And that means that the positions of individual objects are not predictable by theory, but instead we make predictions for the distribution of those objects, the statistical distribution of those objects. And we summarize those distributions using correlations between tracers, in particular 2-point correlation functions. So things that look like this here. So looking at the correlation between the density in one part of the universe at some position x1 and the density at another part of the universe at some position x2. Or equivalently in Fourier space, we can look at the density at some particular wave mode, K1 and K2, and look at their correlation. So these 2-point correlations can also be summarized by power spectra. So it's this big P of K that I'm going to be talking about a lot today. And this power spectrum describes, in essence, the amount of variation, the that you have in your field at a particular scale, K. And so this is, if your field is Gaussian, this is a perfect summary of all of the information, all of the statistical information in your field. And so as cosmologists, our job is to compare measured and predicted correlations or power spectra, and to, by doing so, to constrain our cosmological models. And we've been doing just that for the last many years. And I think this figure here summarizes quite nicely the state of the field. So this is taken from the Planck the Planck CMB analysis that was released in 2018. And what I'm showing here is the matter power spectrum. So looking at the variance of the matter field as a function of inverse scale wave number K. So on the left-hand side here is larger scales, and then going further right, you get to smaller scales. And the points here are measurements that we've made of this matter power spectrum from a variety of observations. Starting with the blue, yellow, blue, orange, and green points, you have measurements from the cosmic microwave background from the Planck satellite. And then the red, purple, and yellow points here are measurements made by galaxy surveys, in particular the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, the BOSS survey, and the Dark Energy Survey. So the Dark Energy Survey is something I'm going to be talking about quite extensively today. And these are, like I said, all galaxy survey measurements. The black line here is a fit to all this data, assuming the lambda cold dark matter model. So that is our standard model of cosmology. And as you can see, this standard model of cosmology provides a good fit to the vast majority of this data. But we can zoom in, and if we summarize the information in that previous plot, these measurements of the matter power spectrum, into just the amplitude, so the amplitude of those points in that previous slide, we start to see some discrepancies popping up. So in particular, measurements of this amplitude of the matter power spectrum coming from the cosmic microwave background is shown here in yellow. And then measurements made from a variety of different analyses of galaxy surveys are these points here. And you can see that there's a discrepancy between these two things. The galaxy surveys are all coming out a little bit low compared with the measurement of the matter power spectrum from the Planck satellite. And so while this is not super statistically significant yet, it's starting to become a little bit tantalizing. And people are starting to get quite interested in this. And so I'm not telling you how we make these measurements yet. I'll get to that, but first I want to tell you a little bit about why you might care that there's a discrepancy here at all. So what we can learn from that discrepancy is, so the reason that there might be a discrepancy there is because the measurement from the Planck satellite of the amplitude of the matter power spectrum and from those galaxy surveys depends on how much structure has grown in between the cosmic microwave background, the time of the cosmic microwave background, about 100,000 years after the Big Bang, and the time of the galaxy surveys, so approximately now. And the growth of structure over that time period is a competition between the expansion of the universe and gravitational collapse. So this competition and the growth of large-scale structure thus depends on the law of gravity. It depends on the metric of our universe, so whether the universe is curved or not. And it also depends on how much mass and energy density there are in relativistic and non-relativistic particle species. And so by measuring the growth of large-scale structure, by measuring the amplitude of that matter power spectrum that I was talking about, we can hope to learn about all of these things. So I think that's a pretty exciting reason to dig a little bit deeper into the potential discrepancies that I was talking about in that previous slide. So hopefully that provides motivation for doing all the science I'm going to be talking about in this talk. Now let's talk a little bit about how we make the measurements that I've been discussing. So we want to probe the underlying matter distribution in the universe. So that's this big fuzzy thing here, this filamentary structure. This is actually from a simulation. It's not real. But the problem with that is that this is mostly dark matter. So matter that does not emit light. And so we can't probe it directly. We have to come up with clever ways of probing it indirectly. And the two ways that I'm going to be talking about doing that in this talk are using the galaxy distribution, this thing here on the left, and also weak gravitational lensing. So this is a map of mass made by weak gravitational lensing here on the right. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer on both of these things. Hopefully that will give you some understanding of how these measurements proceed. So we'll start with the galaxy distribution. So this is a map of all of the galaxies that were observed by the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So this is two different hemispheres of the sky, and then angle on the sky, and then going out from the middle to the exterior of the circle is looking further back in time or higher redshift. And so you can see this, the galaxies here trace out a filamentary structure that looks like the dark matter distribution I was showing in the previous slide. And indeed, we do believe that the galaxies in this map trace the underlying dark matter structure in our universe. But the way that they do that is very complicated. So one way to illustrate that is if we run a simulation of structure formation in our universe, and this time one that has galaxies in it, we can look at just the underlying dark matter distribution, so the thing that we're trying to probe. So that's this thing shown here on the left. And then we can look at what the matter distribution that lives in this dark matter, the galaxy distribution that lives in this matter distribution looks like. It looks something like this. And so if you have a keen eye, you'll notice that the galaxies populate only the densest regions in this matter distribution here, the nodes of this cosmic web that we call dark matter halos. And so the connection between the galaxies and the dark matter distribution, sometimes referred to as the galaxy halo connection, is something that's very complicated, and it depends on galaxy formation physics that we don't fully understand. Often, in order to learn anything about the matter distribution from the galaxy distribution, we have to kind of parameterize our ignorance of what this connection is and marginalize over those parameters and hope that there's still some information remaining once we do that. Okay, so the other field that I'm going to be talking about today is weak gravitational lensing. So like I said before, this is a map of the mass in our universe made via weak gravitational lensing. This is coming from the Dark Energy Survey Year 1 analysis. The red points here are the reddish regions here are areas where there's more mass in our universe, and the blue are regions where there's less mass. So just a quick, very quick primer on how we can go from a galaxy survey to measurements of this mass. And that's illustrated in this little figure here on the right. So what we measure in weak lensing surveys are the ellipticities of galaxies. And the reason why these ellipticities of galaxies are sensitive to the mass in the universe is through the bending of light around massive structures in our universe. So there's one such massive structure in the bottom left-hand part of this image here. And you can see the ellipticities of the galaxies in this image are severely distorted around this mass. And that's something that we call the strong lensing regime. And we're not going to be particularly interested in that strong lensing regime today. Instead, we're going to care about what happens when you're further away from these very large mass distributions, such as up in the right-hand corner of this image here. We can zoom in, and unless you're very, very observant, I don't think you're going to notice anything particularly interesting about the ellipticities of the galaxies in this region. But if you take the average ellipticity of all these galaxies, it's going to look like it's going to align with this line, this black bar here. And this black bar itself is tangentially aligned to the line that connects this big massive structure here to this part of the image here. And it's this tangential alignment of galaxy shapes around massive structures in our universe that allows us to probe the mass distribution in our universe using galaxy ellipticities. So that all sounds very fine and good, but in practice, this is an incredibly difficult measurement to make. we're measuring these observed ellipticities of galaxies. And the galaxies themselves have intrinsic ellipticities. They're not spheres. And these intrinsic ellipticities are of order 20 or 30%. And we're looking for a gravitational shearing of those ellipticities that's about a % level effect. So on top of the fact that this gravitational shear is much, much smaller than the intrinsic ellipticities, we also have to deal with the fact that we have measurement biases coming in, because measuring the ellipticities of galaxies in noisy images that are smeared out by instrumental effects is a very difficult thing to do. So in practice, we have these biases that we have to deal with. So a multiplicative and an additive bias. And all of this is the thing that combines to give you your your observed ellipticity. So by taking correlations of these observed ellipticities, we can probe the mass distribution, but with all of these complications that I was just talking about. And so those complications make the measurement and modeling of these lensing statistics quite difficult in practice. Okay, so the thing that we're going to care about in this talk is not just the galaxy positions and the galaxy ellipticities on their own, but also the cross correlation between those things. And in particular, I'm going to be talking a lot today about an analysis called a 3 times 2 point analysis. So this type of analysis is a combination of 3 different correlation functions or power spectra. So the first of which is the autocorrelation of galaxy positions. The second is the autocorrelation of galaxy ellipticities. The first one is autocorrelation of galaxy positions. That's called galaxy clustering. The autocorrelation of galaxy ellipticities is called cosmic shear. And then the cross correlation between galaxy positions and galaxy ellipticities is something called galaxy-galaxy lensing. So these 3 different correlation functions are all probing the same underlying matter distribution, the thing that we actually care about, and they all probe this in slightly different ways. And so by combining them, we are able to break degeneracies between the nuisances that I was talking about in the last few slides. So this nuisance that the galaxy distribution is a biased tracer of the matter distribution, the fact that there are all these measurement biases in the weak lensing, and we can marginalize over those effects and get a much more precise picture of what's going on with the underlying matter distribution by combining these things. And just to illustrate that fact with a figure, this is constraints from this particular combination of data from the Dark Energy Survey year 1 data. So this is a lensing survey that has finished gathering data that I'll talk about quite a bit more later in the talk. But this is just kind of a teaser. So on the x-axis here is the amount of matter in the universe. The y-axis is this thing that we've been talking about so far in this talk, the amplitude of the matter power spectrum, or the amount of matter clustering in the universe. And these 3 different contours are 3 different combinations of those measurements that I was talking about. So blue here is the autocorrelation of galaxy ellipticities. So that's the lensing only measurement. The orange here is the combination of the galaxy position autocorrelation and the cross correlation between galaxy positions and lensing. So that's like I said, orange. And the combination of all 3 of these correlation functions is what's shown in black. And you can see by combining these statistics, we get a much tighter constraint on this parameter that we care about. That's going to hopefully tell us about fundamental physics. Okay, so this is a fairly immature analysis technique. It's only really been done over the last 5 or so years. But I think I've now motivated for you why we want to pursue it further. And in particular, we want to use this analysis technique in upcoming so-called stage 4 cosmology experiments that are already starting to take data and will kind of reach the peak of their power in the next decade. So we want to mature this analysis into something that's going to be accurate and robust, accurate and precise enough to get unbiased cosmological constraints from these upcoming data sets. In particular, something that I care deeply about is the cross correlation between the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument data. So that's something, that's the stage 4 survey that's just turned on that I'll mention briefly at the very end, with other weak lensing survey data that's going to be taken by the Vera Rubin Observatory, large, what's it called now? Legacy Survey of Space and Time, and lensing from an upcoming cosmic microwave background experiment, the S4 cosmic microwave background experiment. So we're going to need models that are accurate enough to confront this very statistically powerful data. And we're also going to need simulations that include all of these cross correlations so that we can develop and test this analysis methodology and make sure that that we're getting the correct answer out. And if we can do those things, then the benefits that we'll be able to reap are going to be very large. So this is a forecast from a DESI collaboration white paper showing now the amount of matter in the universe on the x-axis, the amount of dark energy in the universe on the y-axis, and then various combinations of data. So black is the cosmic microwave background, blue is weak lensing data, red is data from this Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument experiment. And then if we combine all of those, and you can see that's where the tightest constraints will come from. So we want to be able to do this in an unbiased way. Okay, so I hope that I hope that will provide motivation for the rest of this talk. And now I'm going to jump into to the roadmap that I was talking about for how we're going to get to those constraints. So first, I'll talk about how we're going to obtain accurate and precise models for the cross-correlation statistics that I've been discussing. But before I talk about those models, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the limitations of current analyses. So one of the main ingredients that we need to extract cosmological information from these galaxy clustering and galaxy lensing statistics is the galaxy power spectrum. And models for the galaxy power spectrum have been developed mostly with 3D spectroscopic surveys in mind. So we're measuring these galaxy correlations in 3-dimensional space. And because we're doing that, we have good signal to noise on fairly large scales. And so the models that have been developed for confronting these analyses have focused mostly on these large scales and break down very quickly on smaller scales. The problem with this is, and so I should say that this figure here shows an example of these 3D spectroscopic galaxy correlation functions. The different colors are not super important for this talk. And this is just 2 different redshift bins. But you can see that even on very large scales, basically all these scales in the analysis are something that I would consider large scales. The signal to noise on these correlation functions are high. But like I was saying earlier, we care about cross correlations between galaxy positions and lensing. So that's what these measurements here are. So now I've switched to harmonic space again. I'm sorry. So now larger scales are on the left and smaller scales are on the right. And these are just a bunch of redshift bin combinations. But these lensing cross correlations are much more sensitive to the small scale nonlinear physics of the matter distribution. And that, in combination with the fact that these lensing surveys tend to be smaller than the galaxy surveys, and so the larger scales are not as well measured, means that in order to remain unbiased in our modeling of these statistics, we need to remove large amounts of the data that we actually measure in these surveys. So all of the grayed out regions here are removed because we can't model them with these perturbation theories. With these models that have been developed for these 3D clustering measurements. So now let's talk a little bit about why those models break down. So these current models, why they break down on small scales. The current models that we use to confront for the galaxy power spectrum that we use to confront this data are based on something called perturbation theory. And the idea behind these perturbation theories is that you start out with some simple solution to your equations of motion, some linear solution to that. And then you plug that linear solution back into your equations of motion. You solve for a higher order solution. You add that onto the linear solution. You kind of do that iteratively And this works nicely when the thing that you're trying to predict is not particularly nonlinear. So the equations of motion are not very nonlinear. And so that works well to describe large scales. So what this figure here on the bottom is showing is a comparison between perturbation theory predictions for the matter power spectrum and those measured from simulations. So the numerator in this y-axis is the theory. At the bottom is the simulated measurement, which you can treat as truth here. So you can see this first order approximation is pretty bad. The next order approximation gets a little bit better. The black line here, the best approximation is can model things to about a wave number of about 0.3. But if they had plotted the next order solution here, you would see that there's really very little improvement on top of this, and so you kind of get diminishing yields by pushing to higher and higher order in these, and that's because the equations of motion of the evolution of the matter distribution in the universe become quite nonlinear on small scales, and that just has to do with how gravity works, and that the fact that the Poisson equation is a nonlinear equation of motion, But luckily, we do have the ability to make predictions for these statistics on smaller scales, and those come from simulation. So that's what's being shown here in this figure here, where we're comparing the prediction of simulations from a variety of different simulation codes. So those are the different colored lines at a few different redshifts, and they're just taking the ratio to some fiducial simulation measurement. And you can see that all of these simulations agree to about k of 1. So that's about 2 or 3 times further reach than we got from these perturbation theories. So I think that provides some motivation to try to pursue using these simulations to make predictions for these the statistics that we care about, these galaxy power spectra. But first, before I get into too much detail about that, I want to tell you a little bit about these simulations themselves. So the simulations that I'm going to be talking about are dark matter only simulations, also called n-body simulations. And I'm showing a nice video of one here. So what happens, I'll just wait a second until it starts playing again, okay, so what we started out with here is a linear matter density field. We then discretize that density field into particles, and we evolve those particles forward in time under just gravity and in an expanding universe. And in doing so, we're able to make non-perturbative, fully nonlinear predictions for the dark matter distribution in our universe that, like I said, are converged to about a k of about 1. And so, that's really nice, but this is, like I said, a dark matter only simulation. What we observe is not just dark matter. So we need to do some post-processing of these simulations in order to connect them to the observations that we actually make of galaxies. And one way of doing that is by using something called a halo occupation distribution. So these halo occupation distributions posit that galaxies live in those dark matter halos that I was talking about earlier. So the nodes of the cosmic web that I've been showing you repeatedly in this talk. And the halo occupation distribution then is a way of parameterizing how many galaxies live in each of those, in each halo of a certain mass. So you can write down some phenomenological model for that. And I'm showing you some parameters of that model here. That they're not super important what those parameters mean, but I've broken them down into kind of two different categories. The first of which are parameters that we actually care about, so cosmological parameters, and then these halo occupation distribution parameters that govern the connection between the dark matter distribution and the galaxy distribution. So the first thing that you'll notice is that there are almost as many of these halo occupation distribution parameters as there are cosmology parameters. And so the second thing is that even with this number of halo occupation distribution parameters, because this model is very phenomenological, it doesn't have a particularly good basis in theory. We don't really have a good feeling for when we should stop adding parameters to this model. And that's a problem because if we were then to use this model to confront some observations of galaxy clustering and lensing that I've been talking about, and we find something interesting, say that this model shows that the amplitude of the matter power spectrum is lower than what the CMB measurements tell us, we wouldn't really have a good way of telling of being certain that that discrepancy was because of actual physics and not just because we had left out a parameter of this halo occupation distribution model. So so we don't really know when to stop adding these parameters, to summarize. But luckily, in the last 5 years, or well, actually 2 years, we've begun to develop an alternative to this halo occupation distribution model that still allows us to use the nice properties of the n-body simulations that I was talking about. So their convergence to smaller scales than the perturbation theory, but sidesteps some of these issues with the halo occupation distribution by basing the connection between matter and the galaxy distribution in the symmetries that we know our equations of motion have to obey. So that means that we can replace this halo occupation distribution with a so-called bias expansion that the perturbation theory uses. So I'll briefly go over this algorithm so that you can get a feel for how it works. The idea is we still generate that initial linear field that we use to run our simulations. We then, from that linear field, compute all of the fields that obey the symmetries of general relativity. So we compute something like just the weighted density field, the density field squared, the tidal shear field, and this is all done in the initial conditions of the simulations. And then we can weight each particle in the simulations by those fields. So we do some weighted sum to give us a so-called proto-galaxy density. So this is the galaxy density at very, very high redshifts, at the redshift that we begin our simulation. And we can then evolve the particles forward using the n-body simulation itself to get a prediction for the nonlinear galaxy density field. And using that nonlinear galaxy density, we can compute all of the relevant auto and cross power spectra between the nonlinear fields. So what does that look like in practice? So this figure here shows the predictions for all of those nonlinear auto and cross spectra between various fields. So this one is just the unweighted particles. This one is the particles weighted by density. This one's the particles weighted by density squared. This one's weighted by the density cubed, and then all the cross correlations. So the solid lines are this, I actually didn't tell you what the name of this model was, but we call it a hybrid effective field theory model. The solid lines are that model, and the dashed lines are just the pure perturbation theory models that are kind of the standard thing that has been used in past analyses. So the two things that you should notice here are, so first I'll say the actual predictions that we get for our galaxy power spectra are just sums over these different component spectra, we call them, weighted by some bias factors. And so what you'll notice about these component spectra is that on large scales, they agree perfectly with the perturbation theory predictions. So the solid and the dashed lines overlap. And I guess I should say that the different colored lines are different redshifts in our simulation. And on small scales, you'll see that they're quite different. So the solid lines differ quite a bit from the dashed lines. But that's a good thing because the perturbation theory breaks down on those small scales. And so we've shown that actually by using these solid lines, these hybrid effective field theory predictions, we're able to improve the small scale reach of our model by about a factor of 2. And the other really nice thing about this model is that it's much it has much less stringent requirements in our simulations. We're not sensitive to all the details of finding halos in our simulations, and because of that, we have much better control over the convergence properties of these predictions. But because we've gotten rid of our ability to analytically predict these solid lines, we need a numerical model for the cosmology dependence of these predictions. So luckily we have just the set of simulations to do that. And this is called the Emulus suite of simulations. So this is something that I've been working on with collaborators for about the last 5 years. So this is the first suite of simulations that we run. We have some other ones coming down the pipe that I won't have a chance to talk about today. But the idea behind this suite of simulations is that we've run 40 simulations that span the cosmological parameter space that's allowed by recent cosmological observations of the cosmic microwave background and of galaxy surveys and supernovae. It's not super important what these constraints are coming from, but the data constraints are these contours in blue and green, and the points that the cosmologies that we run simulations at are these black points. So you can see they kind of span the full range that's allowed by these constraints. And this is in a WCDM parameter space. And then the red points here are just simulations that we've run to kind of test our predictions to make sure that they're actually accurate enough. So the way that we're going to use this simulation suite to make the predictions I was talking about for the cosmological dependence of that hybrid effective field theory model is as follows. So we run that large suite of simulations, the Emulus project simulations. We then go ahead and measure all of those component spectra that I was talking about. And because we have them measured in a bunch of different cosmologies, we can then just interpolate between these measurements as a function of cosmology. So you can see this panel here corresponds to the cosmology dependence of these spectra here. And likewise, this one corresponds to the cosmology dependence of there. And so you can see that these spectra do depend quite significantly on things like the amplitude of the matter power spectrum. This is, I forgot to put a nice user-friendly label on this, but this is the parameter that we've been talking about, the amplitude of the matter power spectrum. Okay, so with this in hand, we can then use this model to actually fit data. And so that's been done now in this nice paper led by Boriana Ajiska. She's actually not a collaborator of ours, but this is a really nice work that kind of illustrates the benefits of this type of model. So this is reanalyzing the dark energy survey, the first year of data from the dark energy survey, using this hybrid effective field theory model. And so again, the x-axis here is the amount of matter in the universe, y-axis is the amplitude of matter clustering. The purple contour here is what we got for our fiducial analysis when we originally did the dark energy survey year 1 analysis. And then all the other contours are the analyses in this paper that use this hybrid effective field theory model. And they just assume the only thing that's varying between these other contours here is how small of scales they analyze. So the green line analyzes to a Kmax of 0.3, and then gray, red, and blue go to Kmax of 0.4, 0.5, and 0.6. So going to smaller and smaller scales. And you can see the contours shrink quite significantly as you push to these smaller scales. And so that's quite exciting. Not only does this model provide a good fit to this data still, but because it's able to analyze that smaller scale data, you're able to more tightly constrain this parameter that we care about, that we're going to hopefully learn fundamental physics from in the coming years. And so this is quite promising for upcoming applications to the Dark Energy Survey and to DESI. And so yeah, I'm very, very excited about this model going forward. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit now. So for the first part of this talk, I told you about the models that we use to confront these lensing and clustering measurements. And now for the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you about how we can then perform end-to-end tests of our analyses, both of the modeling and of the measurement process using cosmological simulations. And to do that, I'm going to use a case study of the Dark Energy survey. So I've mentioned the survey quite a few times at this point. Here's a little bit more detail about it. Maybe I should have presented this a little bit earlier, but it's an imaging survey of the southern sky that was done on the 4-meter Blanco telescope in Cerro Tololo, Chile. It's about a 5,000 square degree survey done in 5 photometric bands, G, R, I, Z, and Y. We're done taking all of our data, and we've produced cosmological constraints from our first 3 years of data. Those are the contours that I showed earlier in this talk. So doing this combined clustering and lensing analysis using the Dark Energy survey data is a Herculean task that involves many different steps. And I have no hope that I'm going to be able to explain all of these different steps to you in this talk, but I just wanted to show you just how many pieces there are to this analysis. So we start with images, we select galaxies, we calibrate redshift distributions, we make sure the ellipticities of all of our galaxies are unbiased. We have to measure our correlation functions, we confront them with the models that I've been telling you about, and all of that goes into then the contours that I've shown you a few times in this talk. And so the piece of all this that I'm going to talk to you about now is this little thing down here. And that is a simulated analysis that then tests a large amount of this framework to make sure that we've connected everything correctly and that all of the individual components themselves work and that in combination they deliver unbiased cosmological constraints. Right, so like I said, the goal is to perform end-to-end tests starting from a simulated galaxy catalog that has realistic systematics in it and going all the way to cosmological parameters from those simulated galaxy catalogs to make sure that we get the right cosmology out, which we know because we ran the simulations with that cosmology. So this is going to be a test of the robustness of our analysis to modeling assumptions and observational systematics. But in order for that to be a convincing test, we really need the galaxy samples that we have in these simulations to have clustering and lensing properties that look like the real data. And we use a number of different galaxy samples in our analysis. And so we need a flexible model that can account for all of these different galaxy samples in the same set of simulations. Okay, just to give an example of what I mean. So we often select multiple galaxy samples in our analyses. So here's just 2 examples of galaxy samples you might want to select. This one is called a luminous red galaxy selection, where we're selecting galaxies in their color and magnitude. So everything above this line gets selected. Or you might want to select some, so this is something that you might do if you want to get very bright galaxies that have that you're able to measure the redshifts of easily. You might also want to select a different type of galaxy, so something that's star forming. That's called an emission line galaxy that's done in different color cuts. And the problem is that the variables that we use for these sample selections correlate with the thing that we actually want to end up measuring, so that the galaxy clustering amplitude. And so that's illustrated in this figure here. Don't worry about all the different panels, just focus on this top one here. So these are all measurements of galaxy clustering as a function of scale. The black points are if you were able to measure the galaxy clustering for all the galaxies that you observe. The blue points here are something like this galaxy selection down here. The red points here are this very different color selection, this luminous red galaxy selection up here. And so you can see that the clustering amplitude that you measure depends very significantly on which type of galaxy you select. And this means that the selection that you make is going to impact the severity of observational and modeling systematics that you have to deal with. So we want to model these correlations in our simulations. And we can do that. We have, and one way that we can do that is a model that I've worked on in the last couple of years. So we run a high resolution n-body simulation that we then combine with a prescription that empirically matches the colors that we observe in the real data onto the simulation. And in doing so, produces a correlation between those colors and magnitudes and the clustering amplitude in the simulations. So this is the points here, the same points I was showing on the previous figure. So those are measurements from the data. And the lines here are this model that then you can see captures these correlations quite well. So that's exactly what we want in our simulations. The issue is that I said that model is needs to be very high resolution. So that means that we can only run very small simulations at high resolution, but we need for the type of pipeline test that we want to do here, we need very large simulations that have many times the volume of the survey that we're considering. And that's because we want to constrain biases in that pipeline I was talking about to small fractions of the statistical precision of our measurements. So that means that the simulations can't be high resolution, they have to be inexpensive. But luckily we have a solution for that as well. Something called ADGALS, which stands for Adding Density Determined Galaxies to Light Cone Simulations. So the idea behind this model is we run that high resolution, expensive galaxy formation model that I was talking about in the previous, previously. And then we can use a machine learning model to bootstrap the information from that high resolution simulation in order to populate lower resolution simulations with galaxies that have those correct correlations that I was talking about. And so that's illustrated in this figure here, where we're just selecting galaxy samples in different brightnesses. So each panel is a different selection. The points here are data. The red lines here are the measurements from the high resolution simulation, which are noisy because it's a small simulation. And then the different colors are progressively lower resolution simulations. And so you can see that the clustering measurements between all of the resolutions of simulations agree with each other quite well. And so even though the lowest resolution simulation that's in this figure is factors of a few lower resolution than the highest resolution simulation, we're still able to reproduce the clustering properties that we want using this machine learning method. And because we can do that, we're able to produce these large suites of simulations and do the tests that we want to do, these end-to-end pipeline tests. So just a brief rundown of how this whole pipeline works. We start with some cosmology. We run the high resolution n-body simulation that I was talking about. We then go out and gather the best galaxy formation constraints that we can get our hands on, and we constrain that high resolution galaxy formation model against those galaxy formation constraints. We then train this ADGALS model on this high resolution simulation and run a bunch of low resolution simulations. We can then populate those low resolution simulations with this ADGALS model, and those galaxies that we populate will then look identical to the galaxies that we got from this high resolution model, but now much more cheaply. We can then calculate lensing information using ray tracing in each of our simulations, apply observational effects, and select the various galaxy samples that we want to use to measure our correlation functions, which are shown here. The points are measurements from the Dark Energy Survey data, and the lines are the simulations. So you can see these match quite well. So just a little bit more about this. How much time do I have? About 10 minutes. So we need redshift distributions and correlation functions from our simulations. So the left-hand side here is comparing redshift distributions in the simulations in colors in 4 different redshift bins to those measured in the data. Those are the dashed lines here. And you're going to see the agreement between the simulations and the data is quite good. And then we can look at all of the different correlations that we measure in our data and compare them to the simulations. Now, this is a huge plot. You don't need to look at any particular panel, but I just want to give you the impression that the simulations do indeed match the galaxy lensing and galaxy clustering measurements in our data, at least to the precision that we need to do these tests convincingly. So once we have those redshift distributions and correlation functions measured, we can then perform our cosmological analysis on our suite of simulations in the same way that we do in our data, and make sure that the result of that analysis gives us the true unbiased cosmology of the simulations. So that true cosmology is this crosshair here. The x-axis is, again, the amount of matter in the universe. The y-axis is the amplitude of the matter power spectrum, again. And the black contour here is what you would get if you had a completely unbiased analysis. And the blue contour here is what we get by running the analysis on this suite of simulations. And so the very small offset that you can see between the black and the blue means that we have successfully reproduced unbiased cosmological constraints in our simulations, which I think gives us quite a bit of faith in this full analysis pipeline, given how complex it is. So once we've done that, we can then go ahead and do the same thing on the real data. So I'm showing this figure again. So this is constraints from the Dark Energy Survey, first 3 years of Dark Energy Survey data, where, again, amount of matter, amplitude of the matter power spectrum, and the blue contour here is the lensing only. Orange is the cross correlation between lensing and galaxy positions, and in addition to the galaxy autocorrelation, and the combination is shown in black here. And then once we've made that, once we've gotten that constraint, we can then go ahead and compare to the Planck constraints to see if there's anything interesting. And indeed, you see that there's this 2-ish sigma discrepancy in this amplitude of the matter power spectrum again, like I was talking about earlier. So still is tantalizing, but not quite statistically significant. But luckily, we have an amazing new survey that has already turned on, the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument. So this is the first stage 4 cosmology survey that has begun taking data. It's on the sister telescope to the Dark Energy Survey Telescope. The Dark Energy Survey Telescope's on is in Chile. This is in Kitt Peak in Arizona. And this is a very different survey. So it's a massively multiplexed, robotically controlled, fiber-fed spectrograph. That's a mouthful. But basically, we're going to be getting 3D positions of galaxies for about 30 million galaxies out to redshift above redshift 2. We've successfully completed science verification in May, and we're currently taking the first year of our main survey data. We can't show you any, we don't, I can't show you cosmology constraints yet. The first real cosmology constraints from the full first year of data won't come until probably late 2022, but we are doing, but we are going to want to do these cross-correlation analyses using the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Survey. So in particular, this Dark Energy Spectroscopic Survey is going to have a lot of overlap with the next generation lensing survey that comes after the Dark Energy Survey. So that's the DESI footprint is in red. This next generation lensing survey, the Vera Rubin Observatory Legacy Survey of Space and Time, is in yellow. And then we're also going to get a new CMB survey from which we'll be able to measure CMB lensing in orange. So there's a lot of overlap between these data sets, and that's going to mean that it's going to be really great data to do this cross correlation science with. We're starting to do that now. We have a first analysis of an older CMB lensing survey coming from the Planck telescope, and we're cross correlating that with one of the galaxy samples that's measured just in the Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument, the imaging data that the spectra are going to be, that the targets are selected from. So that analysis is going to be coming out in a little less than a month, probably, or maybe approximately a month. But this will be the first analysis that uses a little bit of DESI data. In particular, we're calibrating the redshift distributions of these photometric galaxies using spectra gathered by an actual DESI survey. So this is going to be slightly lower constraining power than the stage 3 analyses that I've been talking about, but it's going to be a very clean measurement in modeling. The large scale CMB lensing is relatively foreground insensitive. Like I was saying, with the redshift distributions are spectroscopically calibrated using DESI. And we're using only large scales that are modelable using pure perturbation theory. And so this is limited by the noise in the Planck lensing map, but this is going to get even more exciting once we have higher resolution CMB surveys that we can make these measurements with. So, okay, with that, I'll summarize. So I think, I hope I've convinced you that cross correlations between lensing and clustering are going to lead to exciting new insights in the next decade. And we're going to have accurate and precise models to confront that data by using combinations of perturbation theory and simulations. We already have a model for the cosmology dependence of that hybrid model ready to be applied to current data. And there's a lot of new directions to go with this type of modeling in the future. And we also have a way of testing this modeling along with the whole measurement pipeline using simulations that we've used to test the dark energy survey analyses. And we're going to be using to test upcoming DESI cross-correlation analyses as well. So keep your eye out for those. With that, I'll conclude and say thanks.
Great, thanks, Joe.